Hello. I wonder if you've ever been to the village of Hope in Derbyshire on the River Now. It's a beautiful village in the middle of the Peak District with all the lovely hills all around, and two in particular overlooking the village. One is called Win Hill. People say that name came originally from willow trees that grew on the hill. The other, on the opposite side of the river, is called Lose Hill. People say that that comes from loose or free, because the land was free for anybody to farm. But some people say Win Hill, Lose Hill on opposite sides of the same river. There must be a story there somewhere. In fact, there is a legend which gives a different explanation to how the two hills got their names. 1300 years ago, England was not one kingdom, it was many. In the southwest there was the kingdom of Wessex, governed over by King Cynegils. To the northeast was Northumbria, ruled over by King Edwin. And in the middle, King Penda governed Mercia. Now, these kings did not always get on very well, as you can imagine. For example, King Cynegils had a huge grudge against King Edwin. Edwin had invaded part of Cynegils' land and taken it for himself. Cynegils knew his army wasn't powerful enough to get it back again, so instead he simply nursed a grudge against King Edwin, constantly trying to think of ways to get back at him, but always failing. And that grudge ate away at his heart so much that eventually it took him to his grave. His sons, Ceolwulf and Quickhelm, were furious and grieving greatly over the loss of their father. Ceolwulf knew that the army, it really wasn't powerful enough to defeat Edwin. But Quickhelm wouldn't let it go. He was determined to get his revenge. So he called his favourite messenger to him, Yuma, and said, Yuma, you must deliver a message to King Edwin, a very special message. Yuma set off a short while later to begin the long journey up to Northumbria, where he would visit King Edwin in his grand castle of Bamborough on the coast. After a few days he got there, and when he asked at the door to go and see King Edwin, the guards laughed at him. He does not see simple messengers, they said. Give us your message and we'll pass it on to him. No, he said, King Quickhelm has instructed that I and I alone must speak the message to King Edwin. It is of the greatest importance. Well, one of the guards disappeared to go and talk to somebody who would talk to somebody who would talk to the king. And eventually the message came back that yes, the king would see him, but it had better be good. He was ushered into the great courtroom where King Edwin was holding court, sitting on his magnificent throne. Around him were all his servants, including his beautiful handmaiden Lilla. Yuma strode forwards and walked in front of the king. Your Majesty, he said, giving a great deep bow, his hand on his breast. I have come to deliver you a message of the utmost importance. And as he did, he slipped his hand inside his cloak and grabbed hold of a dagger. Before anybody knew what was happening, he thrust the dagger out and was running towards King Edwin to kill him. There was great uproar and pandemonium. Everybody tried to stop him and to protect King Edwin, including Lilla, the beautiful handmaiden, who could see no alternative but to put herself between the king and Yuma. The dagger went forward, it hit flesh, it pierced a heart, and a soul was destroyed. But not the soul of King Edwin. It was Lilla, who had died protecting her king. Well, in the uproar that followed, Yuma too lost his life. But King Edwin had lost more than that. He'd lost his favourite handmaiden, and he'd lost his dignity and the respect of his people. He had to get it back. This meant war. Ceolwulf and Quickhelm decided that they needed to gather support, and so they asked King Penda of Mercia to help them too. And they arranged to meet King Edwin and his army in the middle of Mercia, near what we now call the Village of Hope. King Edwin got there first, and he saw the two hills, and he saw that the greater of the two, Win Hill, was the place to be. From there, from the summit, he could look down on everything that was happening, and he would see any of his enemies coming. He made a camp there, and as he was doing so, the army of King Quickhelm and King Ceolwulf and King Penda arrived. Seeing that Win Hill was already occupied, they climbed up Lose Hill and made their camp there instead. From Win Hill, King Edwin's army could see that Lose Hill's army was also a great one. The battle would be fierce, but they might not actually win. What could they do? King Edwin had to come up with a plan. He told his men to build a wall around the summit that they were occupying, so that they were completely surrounded by stones. "We cannot build a fancy wall," they said. "There isn't time. We will have to fight them tomorrow." "I don't need a fancy wall, I just need lots of rocks, all lined up in a circle around our hill to protect us." So that was what they did, muttering a little, wondering how on earth this could protect them. The next day, ambassadors were sent down to the bottom of the two hills to speak to each other before the battle would begin, as was the custom. They stood on opposite banks of the River Noe. The ambassador representing Penda and Quickhelm and Ceolwulf went first. "You have insulted my master and his family and his friends by taking a piece of land that is not rightfully yours. This river will run red with your men's blood before the day is out, and you will cede that land once more to its rightful owner." Then from the other side came the shout back, "We will never cede. You too have done us a great harm. You have killed our master's favourite maidservant, Lilla. Her life will be paid for with many of your lives. And this day will not end before this river itself has changed its course around the bodies of those men you have brought to try and kill us in vain." There was no going back, there was no compromise. The two ambassadors retreated, and battle was prepared to join. Oh, and it was a fierce battle indeed. Many years later, a poet wrote about it. This is what he said: "You hills were witness to the well-fought day. They saw our phalanx stand in grim array. They heard each warrior strike the pounding shield, and dare the invading legions to the field. The din of battle through the dale resounds, with every blow to the listening rocks rebounds." It was a mighty fight indeed. At first, the armies of Wessex were losing. King Edwin's army was pushing them back, further away from the river. But as often happens in a battle, the luck turned, and then the Wessex army were in command. They were pushing King Edwin back up the hill. But there was a signal, and with that signal all of King Edwin's men knew what to do. They turned tail and ran back up to the top of the hill and hid behind the wall. The men of Wessex were delighted. The men of Northumbria were cowards, it seemed. They hid and cowered behind tiny little rocks. How silly of them. They would soon be overwhelmed, and they began to run up the hill after the men of Northumbria. It wasn't until they were puffing and panting halfway up the hill that they began to see that this had been a trap all along. King Edwin's men, now safely behind their wall of rough rocks, began to push. And one by one these mighty rocks, for they were not small stones, began to fall, began to roll, began to tumble, began to gather great speed, so that by the time they reached the men of Wessex and hit them, they were like mighty weapons, like bombs going off, falling and dropping on the men of Wessex. Man after man after man was killed by these great boulders, crushing them to death. So many boulders, it was like rain falling upon them. Eventually, the men of Wessex had to turn tail and run as fast as they could to avoid the boulders hitting them some more. And the battle was over. At the foot of the hill, there were indeed the bodies of many men of Wessex who had been killed that day by the actions of King Edwin and his great army. The boulders and the bodies were so many that the river had indeed changed its course around those boulders. So from that day on, locals remembered how they had become under the control of King Edwin, and not King Penda or King Ceolwulf or King Quickhelm. And they remembered it by calling the two hills Lose Hill, for the hill on which the losers camped, and Win Hill, for the hill on which the winners camped. They still have those names today. Well, I wonder what you think. Do you think that lovely story, that battle story, is the one that caused the hills to get their names? Or was it the rather more boring reason to do with geography? People cannot agree. I wonder if you can.